It was mid-April, late afternoon, amidst the dimming sunlight over the Pacific Ocean, when the body of a woman was discovered, and she was missing her right leg. What initially appeared to be a fatal shark attack would reveal other signs of brutal force and violence, and possibly something much more sinister than an animal attack. Who was this victim? And was a great white shark to blame for her death? Or was there a monster to blame with a human face instead? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Some cases that I cover are not so clear-cut as being a case of homicide, but some stories are so compelling in how they leave so many lingering, unanswered questions that I am drawn to them. I want to learn more for myself as a researcher, as a writer, as a listener. This is the story of Michelle von Emster of Ocean Beach, California. The area known as Sunset Cliffs is a 68-acre coastal reserve that runs 1.5 miles along the Point Loma Peninsula in San Diego County. The Sunset Cliffs are breathtakingly beautiful, but also very hazardous. The beach walls are composed of rutted sandstone with ledges that can plunge 75 feet down into the surf. Chunks of sandstone can sporadically break off and fall into the ocean. This creates a highly unpredictable and dangerous environment, considered to be one of the most picturesque oceanside views and landscapes in all of Southern California, with awesome ocean views, spectacular sunsets, dramatic cliff formations, fascinating caves, and intertidal zones. It is a worldwide natural attraction. Some people perform their weddings there. Others' lives have ended at the famous site. There are guardrails that section off the most problematic areas, but not everyone obeys the warning signs. Lying just a few miles north of Sunset Cliffs sits a small neighborhood, a little beach town called Ocean Beach, commonly called just the OB to locals. It is a vibrant bohemian neighborhood known as the laid-back, hippie version of the more upbeat party college vibe offered in its sister neighborhood, Pacific Beach. The surf breaks along Sunset Cliffs have all been assigned very unique names by the locals, all bizarre and cryptic. There's Loscums, Subs, Pillars, Needles, Rock Slide, and No Surf. There are also 2 spots known as South Garbage and North Garbage. These 2 areas sit at the foot of the Sunset Cliffs Regional Park. They were named for the spot's distinct smell associated with its decaying kelp. Despite its name, the garbage breaks are known as the most popular spots for local surfers. They are designated for intermediate to advanced surfers only due to its challenging cliffs, exposure to reefs, and long paddles. The north garbage is only accessible via a metal staircase, and the south can only be reached from a dirt lot with a rope-assisted trail leading down to the shore. These are not areas of the beach where any spectator, local or otherwise, can be seen swimming or surfing around in. It was a few hours before the sun would paint itself across the horizon and appear to slide into the Pacific Ocean, turning the orangish peak streaks of light into dusk. A young surfer was enjoying the last hours of waves when his eyes discovered something bizarre. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing, as several seagulls looked as if they were standing on the ocean surface. The birds were roosting and pecking at an unidentifiable item that was floating and bobbing outside the break at South Garbage. These spots, as mentioned, are usually extremely popular with surfers, but on that afternoon the breaks were small, so the area was unusually quiet. David Correa, who was later identified as the surfer, yelled out to the only other surfer around to go check out what the seagulls were doing. The second surfer, identified as an older man named William Dostal, was closer to the area, so he was first to paddle over. As he got to the mysterious sight, the seagulls squealed and flew away. When he saw what they were feasting on, he called something back to David, which he couldn't quite hear, and then paddled quickly back to shore. Once David reached the same spot that the seagulls had scattered away from, he was horrified and in shock at what he saw. It was the body of what appeared to be a young woman. Her body had floated up a swell, crested, and then went down the backside. David quickly paddled to shore. At 3:18 p.m., Lifeguard Communications received a distress call. A man named Andrew Todd was standing nearby, and he mentioned something about it appeared that two surfers, located almost straight out from Point Loma Nazarene University, appeared to be holding a body. John Little and Tom Thayer left their station at Ocean Beach 1 minute later. Bruce Robinson and John Wade left their dock in Mission Beach in a rescue vessel. The lifeguards from Ocean Beach were closest to the scene, and they arrived at 3:24 p.m. Mission Beach police officer Lieutenant Frank Powell joined them. All three men climbed around the cliffs looking for someone who might need help, but they saw nothing. They drove north up Sunset Cliffs Boulevard, scouring the coves and breaks, but still there was no sign of anyone. Only a few minutes later, while the two lifeguards in a rescue vessel from Mission Beach arrived, they drove through the kelp beds, and that's when they found what they were looking for. There she was, a woman floating face down, her body bobbing in the sea. A few hundred yards away from the coastline, her arms floated out toward the waves, and what remained of her legs curled up beneath her body, forming a macabre question mark. She was nude. The woman wore 2 rings and a brass bracelet. Her long brown hair spread and flowed eerily with the rhythm of the water. One wing from a blue butterfly tattoo was still present on her right shoulder blade. The other wing was missing, along with a large chunk of her flesh. The victim couldn't have been any older than her early to mid-20s. By 4 p.m., with the assistance of a second rescue vessel, Rescue 1, they returned to its headquarters with a body bag containing an unidentified female. Although upon initial observation, the cause of death wasn't obvious, it was clear that trauma was involved. Subsequently, the medical examiner's office took over jurisdiction. Robert Engel from the medical examiner's office was first on the scene. His initial examination of the body was as it lay still on the dock of Rescue 1's station. Dr. Engel observed how most of the victim's right leg was gone, and the body revealed large wounds that appeared to be torn off, and there was a lot of missing tissue. It was estimated that the female had been in the sea for a long time. Nothing was located on her body to identify her, except for the partial butterfly tattoo on her right shoulder. Her cause of death was not specifically documented at the time, but all parties involved believed she had been victim of a shark attack. and possibly had been torn apart by more than one. An official autopsy was performed on the victim the next day by San Diego medical examiner Brian Blackburn. The young woman bore several injuries, many of them quite severe, illustrating the horror she must have faced in her last moments of life. Her face had been scraped raw and had multiple bruising and contusions. The victim's neck was broken, and there was bleeding along the vertebrae and underneath her scalp. As already mentioned, most of her right leg was gone. It had been torn off mid-thigh, her buttocks, parts of her arms, and her left leg looked as if it had gone through a meat shredder. Only fragments of tissue and bone remained. Her ribs were shattered. One had been fractured, and the other 3 badly injured. The victim's pelvis had been ripped apart by force, with 7/8 separation of the pubic bone. The young woman had bled internally, and she had drowned. It was a horrifying realization that she had been alive during whatever had attacked her and torn her to shreds. That same night, the news reported an unidentified woman found deceased in the ocean near Sunset Cliffs, the victim of a brutal great white shark attack. The only thing they had to identify her by was a small butterfly tattoo on her right shoulder. When this information splashed across her television, an art and frame shop owner, Denise Knox, immediately thought of one of her employees. She was a young woman with a butterfly tattoo who had failed to show up for her shifts on Friday and Saturday. When the possibility of it being her struck Denise, she and her husband exchanged glances, and she at once contacted the police. Mrs. Knox spoke with the medical examiner over the phone for about 30 minutes. She could only provide him with a generic description of the young woman, and since the doctor had already been bothered by incessant calls that had led to nothing, he kept asking her for more personal details. Denise Knox informed the medical examiner that her employee did not shave her armpits nor her legs. When she mentioned these details, it matched the description of his victim. The doctor requested that Denise Knox come in to view the body. Early that Sunday morning, she, along with the shop owner, drove to Kearny Mesa to meet with the medical examiner. When asked to ID the body, Denise Knox was overwhelmed with the thought of viewing a corpse, especially of someone she knew. Instead of viewing the body, the medical examiner photographed the young woman and then showed Denise Knox a Polaroid of her face. She recognized her young employee at once, and she was quoted as saying that she looked at peace in the image, which she found to be odd. At last, the young victim had been identified. She was 25-year-old Michelle von Emster. Based on what Michelle had told her, Michelle had beaten leukemia and had been in remission for the last 2 years after enduring hellish rounds of radiation treatment. Michelle had been living in the Ocean Beach area for the last couple of years while saving up money. Michelle had just given her boss, Denise Knox, notice that she would be leaving at the end of April to move back up north where her family lived in the San Francisco area. There was an endless bounty of reporters who wanted to speak to Denise Knox. News trucks parked in front of her shop and even came to her home. Michelle's roommate, identified as Coco Campbell, was the last known person to have seen Michelle. She told investigators and news reporters that on the last day, that she and Michelle had attempted to get into a concert that night and had failed to do so. It was believed to be Pink Floyd who was in town that night and would have meshed with the scene Michelle was associated with. Coco said that she dropped Michelle off somewhere after 8 p.m. along Newport Avenue, which was only 6 blocks from their shared residence. She described Michelle as being in a weird mood. She was acting strangely, and she did not want to go home yet. The official notes of her interview with police were unfortunately destroyed due to the department's policy that case files can be destroyed after 7 years. I find it so absurd and irresponsible that this is ever done. Now granted, her official cause of death was considered an accident, but with how many questions still lingered around the incident, it makes no sense to have destroyed the death investigation records. In this day and age, with everything being electronic, there is no justifiable reason that departments continue to destroy their files. This protocol ranges from state to state, of course, and depending on the official cause of death. Whether it is homicidal, accidental, or undetermined, this can often dictate how long a department is allowed to keep or destroy case files. The only thing that remained of the death investigation records into Michelle von Emster's death, what is referred to as a fact sheet. According to Coco Campbell's statement, Michelle was wearing a green trench coat on the night she was last seen. Michelle never returned to their shared residence after she dropped her off. Her trench coat was never found, nor were any other items of clothing. If one is to believe Coco Campbell's account of Michelle's last known whereabouts, then the medical examiner's timeline would place Michelle in the ocean after midnight. It was a cool 57 degrees outside, and the water would have only been a few degrees warmer. The tide was very high that night, with 3-foot waves crashing against the coastline. It was a new moon, and the sky was full of clouds, making it an extremely dark and unwelcoming invitation to the sea. Medical examiner Blackburn posited that the severe conditions didn't deter Michelle from getting into the water alone without any clothing, although there was nothing, much less a witness, to support his theory. Michelle was considered a novice surfer, but she also had her own wetsuit back at the apartment. The medical examiner had declared her official cause of death as being accidental, and that she had drowned after a brutal attack by a great white shark. Investigators were quick to close the case. For many, it was closed much too fast, with very little investigation having been done. There were lingering doubts around what or who had led to this young woman's death and the events surrounding her unexplained injuries. Reporters and the community demanded more answers than they were given. Medical examiner Brian Blackburn had never had any experience with a shark fatality, nor had any other individuals across the different teams of the investigation. When this bizarre case came across his office, Blackburn reached out to the world-renowned Scripps Institute of Oceanography. They are the leaders in this field. As a child growing up in Southern California, I myself went on various sea expeditions along this area of San Diego County with my elementary school class and a female marine biologist who worked for Scripps. Richard Rosenblatt was the chairman of the graduate department at the time, and a professor of marine biology when medical examiner Blackburn contacted him. Mr. Rosenblatt invited medical examiner Blackburn to come visit him at Scripps. A forensic dentist was also present during the consultation. Mr. Rosenblatt informed medical examiner Blackburn that only a great white shark would be capable of biting off the woman's leg. Great white sharks can grow up to 5,000 pounds, and their bite strength has been compared to that of the T-Rex. However, he specifically said that if it was a shark, then it had to be a great white, but not that it was necessarily a shark that took her leg. Professor Rosenblatt never viewed Michelle von Emster's body, and from what he was told about her other serious injuries, those were not inflicted by a shark. There was also the high contradiction in shark hunting behavior. Great white sharks have light-activated retinas, so in other words, they swim up from the bottom of the ocean looking for silhouettes of seals in the waves. During daylight hours, great white sharks don't hunt at night. Michelle's body was found in approximately 10 feet of water. So if hypothetically a shark had hunted her at night, such as the blue shark, her body would have been discovered in much deeper water. However, blue sharks are not known for attacking humans alive, although they will feast on dead bodies. There was strong evidence of this, as there were much smaller shark tooth marks on her remains. There were 5 bite marks on her abdomen that could have matched the tooth impressions of a great white shark, but the bites were very shallow and didn't penetrate past the surface of her skin. Michelle was tiny, standing only 5'2" and weighing 120 pounds, so it would have taken very little force, especially from a great white shark, to rip through her abdomen. 3 days after Michelle's remains were recovered from the sea, Ralph Collier, a shark expert, was quoted as stating that, based on preliminary reports, the shark attack diagnosis was probably valid. That would make her death the first confirmed fatality from a shark along the Pacific coast since 1989. That is until Ralph Collier saw the actual remains of her leg bone. The medical examiner Brian Blackburn, interestingly, had preserved a piece of Michelle's femur for further examination. According to Collier, the condition of the limb didn't make sense to how a white shark bites. The break a white shark makes is so clean. It's as if the limb was removed with a table saw. But the condition of her femur looked more like how a piece of bamboo would look after being cut down to a point with a knife. The bone was literally pointing out, which would occur if a bone is twisted under a great amount of brute force. A leader in his field, Ralph Collier, had examined upwards of 100 photos of shark-related cases and had not once viewed bones that had come to a point. He suggested that such an injury could be caused by something like a propeller of a boat's engine, but not from a shark. Something also stood out from Michelle von Emster's autopsy report that bothered him more. Sand was found deep inside Michelle's body. It was located in her mouth, throat, nasal passages, lungs, and her stomach. For that to happen under the alleged premise of a shark attack having caused her death, the shark would have grabbed Michelle, then pushed her down to the bottom of the ocean, face first. White sharks don't pull their prey face down to the bottom of the ocean, forcing them to ingest massive amounts of sand. Further, for sand to have entered her lungs, it would have been necessary for Michelle to have still been alive. That would have been impossible, since if her leg had been bitten off by a shark, it would have caused such severe wounds to her femoral artery that she would have bled out very quickly. And for sand to have been present in her stomach, she would have had to have taken in a large gulp of air just as her face made contact with the sand. Collier also determined that her multitude of bruises and cuts would have been induced while she was still alive. What further supported his stance that Michelle von Emster's death had not been the result of a shark attack was that there were no impressions of shark teeth among the many bite marks found on her torso. Any shark tooth collectors and enthusiasts are already aware that great white shark teeth are very uniquely shaped and long, and the size of the shark is directly associated with the size of their tooth marks or tooth impressions. Their fangs would have left very clear and distinct impressions on her body. if in fact a great white shark had bitten her. Ralph Collier was not merely a so-called expert on sharks. He was the world-recognized leading authority on Pacific Coast white shark behavior and ecology, the founder of the Shark Research Committee and the author of Shark Attacks of the 20th Century from the Pacific Coast of North America. It would be irrational to doubt his word or expertise on the subject. Dr. Harry Bunnell, a longtime pathologist, was recorded as having been witness to Michelle von Emster's autopsy. When he was interviewed years later, he confirmed that he wasn't present. However, in cases of homicide, it is policy to have a witnessing pathologist. So Brian Blackburn claimed he was there to cover his own procedure in case the official cause of death was homicide. While looking over the documentation of the autopsy report, Dr. Bunnell clarified how nothing in the report indicated that the shark attack occurred before Michelle died. He suggested that in all likelihood, it was possible that her neck was broken or severely injured while she was still breathing, and this would have undoubtedly incapacitated her. The pathologist also pointed out how there was sufficient evidence that she had drowned, but that she was alive when she initially went into the water. Regarding the sand discovered inside her lungs, Dr. Bunnell specified that in order for sand to get inside the bronchi, it would have to be inhaled. Similar to how soot in the bronchi is a determining factor in whether a victim of a fire was dead prior to or still alive during the fire, soot in the lungs indicated that Michelle was alive, and that sand is never seen in the lungs of someone who had drowned. This is because if someone is struggling to not drown, they would be at the top of the water, thrashing around, doing everything imaginable to breathe. They aren't at the bottom of the ocean or on the coastline, willingly ingesting sand. There was also the way her body was shaken so forcibly that it caused whiplash, which is not something an ocean animal would commonly do. That is an action that would be done by something or someone on land. Dr. Bunnell also pointed out how there was only slight wrinkling on Michelle's fingers, which anyone who has even spent a little extra time in the pool or even in a bath knows that water wrinkles up one's fingers after being immersed for more than 30 minutes. If Michelle drowned and was attacked the night before, her body would have been in the water for a minimum of several hours, but with only a small amount of wrinkling. This indicated that she wasn't in the ocean, alive, for more than 30 minutes. Unfortunately, her exact time of death was never determined, since the medical examiner had failed to test her liver temperature to even provide a solid estimated time of death. According to Dr. Boyd Stevens, a chief medical examiner in San Francisco, the severe injuries made to Michelle von Emster's ribs, pelvic area, and her neck would be more commonly associated with a serious fall or a car accident. The ocean water is much too dense and cushiony to cause such severe wounds. There was also the fact that her autopsy report revealed other injuries never properly addressed. Michelle's nose had a large bruise across it, abrasions on both of her cheeks, and a small cut on her forehead. She also had multiple scrapes and bruises on her arms and chest, but her hands strangely remained without any marks. Michelle von Emster's grisly death became hot fuel for papers and television to sell her story. Her bizarre, mysterious death played out like a scene from Jaws. A young, attractive woman dives into the ocean late at night, alone and nude, for a midnight swim, only to be ripped to pieces by an evil great white shark. But over the following weeks, the shark warnings articles about the dangers of the ocean, and the young woman's macabre death being simplified as a tragic shark attack began to die down, and questions and serious doubts around the investigation's findings began to surface. The community, specifically those who were great white shark experts, renowned behaviorists, and defenders of sharks, didn't believe the autopsy findings equated to a shark attack at all. In fact, at the time of the incident, there was no proof that a great white shark had been within 50 miles of where Michelle von Emster's body was found. Shark authorities refused to place her death with any of the institutions that held such records, like the Shark Research Committee and the International Shark Attack File. Medical examiner Brian Blackburn had been placed front and center at what became, at least to that point, the highest profile case of his career. He answered critics and the community's concerns alike by simply asking them the same question. If it wasn't a white shark, then what was it? Fatal shark attacks are very rare along the California coast. The chance of being killed by a great white is extraordinarily rare. In fact, from the first recorded fatal attack in 1926 up to 1994, there had only been 7 recorded, and only 1 in the San Diego region. The official cause of death went from a tragic accident to a series of still unanswered questions. There were countless stories spread by the community about what had really caused Michelle von Emster's death. Some believed she had willingly dived into the ocean that night, or she had been pushed from the cliffs, or she accidentally fell to her death from the treacherous Sunset Cliffs. Other people contemplated that maybe Michelle took her own life, or while she was surfing the waves, her face planted and the force broke her neck. And yet some people believed she was the victim of a stalker, or maybe some other maniac, or even a drugged-out vagrant running around the beaches at night. One of the latter seemed to be the more likely scenario. But who this woman was, and why she was alone in the water, continue to mystify experts and haunt those who knew her to this day. One of 5 girls, Michelle von Emster, lived most of her life in San Carlos, California, situated in San Mateo County, also referred to as Silicon Valley. It is one of the most affluent areas in the state and the country. Michelle graduated from the all-girl high school Notre Dame in 1986 and attended St. Mary's College for a few years. Tragically, in 1991, Michelle was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. After years of pain and suffering she faced at the hands of horrific radiation treatment, Michelle took off on a trip to the West Coast with one of her girlfriends and fell in love with the place, especially Ocean Beach. She also told one of her friends that she was traveling in Europe, but according to Michelle's mother, Bernadette, she highly doubted that story, and she informed reporters after her daughter's death that Michelle had never left to go anywhere. Bernadette said that Michelle told her she was returning to the Bay Area in a few weeks, but that her daughter told her a lot of things, so she just didn't really know. She was quoted as saying that her daughter Michelle liked to talk like she'd been around the world 3 times, but she had never really gone anywhere. After her death, there was gossip that Michelle had been a big partier, mixed up with the wrong crowd, and maybe she overdosed at a party, and that someone or multiple persons then dumped her body off a boat. However, according to the toxicology screenings, there was 0 substances found on her body. There was no alcohol, no drugs, including any prescription medications. There had also been talk, often vicious sounding, about Michelle having been involved in sex work. This idea was never considered, and the medical examiner neglected to ever test her body for sexual activity. This showed that the rumors were simply that, and Michelle had been committed to a healthy lifestyle. In 1992, Michelle von Emster was renting a home in Point Loma, California, a very nice suburban area. But something kept drawing her closer and closer to Ocean Beach. She found herself there, living in various people's houses over the next 2 years, renting out rooms. Michelle was brought up in a very nice environment, but at that point, she was solely supporting herself. So a nice room in a fancy house may have felt like the closest thing she could get to being home. Every time Michelle relocated, she got closer and closer toward the beach until she found herself in a shared 2-bedroom home in Ocean Beach. It was not a pleasant nor safe environment. The locals referred to it as the war zone because the section was notorious for drugs and mayhem, but it had the most affordable rent that was still right on the beach. Michelle lived the best she could. She worked many different minimum wage jobs and didn't drive a car, so she could help make ends meet. According to one of her friends, Maureen Gantz, Michelle was one of the sweetest and kindest, friendliest people she had ever known. But Maureen also told reporters that Michelle felt uncomfortable, uneasy around some of the people in the area, in particular those known as the peer crowd. In Michelle's application that was submitted to Cabrillo Stationery and Office Supply, the business of her employer Denise Knox, Michelle wrote, "I am personally very interested in art." When Michelle worked there, she told Denise Knox about how she had to leave her other job at Rumor's coffee shop because she was being stalked. She was hoping that if she was working some day shifts instead, it would encourage the man to stop. According to Denise Knox, she wasn't aware of his name, and maybe Michelle didn't know either, but she knew that he rode a motorcycle. According to Denise Knox, she was given a photocopy of Michelle von Emster's autopsy report by a man in her shop. This man, a local man, somehow had a copy of the autopsy report. He came to the shop multiple times with the strangest request that duplicates of the autopsy report be made. So Denise Knox kept one of the records for herself. On the last page in the report, written shakily in the hand of someone obviously distressed, was the statement, "Blue sharks? Bullshit." Little was ever learned about this mysterious local man with Michelle's autopsy report, but he rode a motorcycle. Others who claimed to have known Michelle von Emster spoke about her to the press in the weeks after her death. However, their accounts of her and their descriptions rarely matched. Some claimed she was a health food junkie, while other people said she partied really hard. Some acquaintances spoke about how she had a C-section scar or that she had an abortion, but nothing of this was ever implied in the autopsy report. But then again, how thorough it was, this is not surprising. Some people said that you could find Michelle meditating in the morning every day on the shoreline, and yet still others claimed Michelle was terrified of the ocean. The last belief was certainly false, because Michelle had done everything she could to live as close to the sea as possible, sacrificing and working whatever measly jobs she could find so she could spend as much time as she could in the waves. Michelle was remembered as a natural, earth-loving beauty, a pretty girl, a hippie chick, who wore jeans and feminine tops or long flowing skirts. She wore brightly colored beads and soaked herself in patchouli oil. She was also considered very intelligent. According to a man named Edwin Decker, who attended a bar at Winston's, which shared the same back door as Rumor's coffee shop, since the two buildings were connected. Michelle had mentioned to him at some point that she preferred to surf in the nude. It wasn't meant to necessarily be provocative or even sexy. It was merely a reflection of her neo-hippie views and lifestyle. Yet strangely, any of the long-term surfers at Ocean Beach ever recalled witnessing a naked woman in the waves. In fact, no one knew Michelle as being a local surfer girl at all. The surf shops in the area and surfers at the Ocean Beach shoreline had never seen her on the beach at all. But one of the lifeguards who saw Michelle the day her corpse was pulled onto the dock recalled seeing the young woman one time in the ocean. Before that day, he remained anonymous due to the sensitivity surrounding her case, but he stated that he saw her in October 1993. He was off-duty free diving for lobster off South Garbage when he noticed someone really far out in the ocean swimming. The person was way further out than any human would normally be. That far out in the sea would become dangerously cold within 15 to 20 minutes in the fall in the Pacific Ocean. Then the person began swimming back toward shore. That's when he noticed that the person was a young woman. The man also stated that she wasn't alone. A man was swimming alongside her who appeared to be in the military based on his short haircut. The lifeguard and the young woman spoke for a few minutes, and then they went their separate ways. He did say that she was swimming topless. Edwin Decker, the bartender at Winston's, did finally charm Michelle enough to get her to have drinks with him at the adjacent bar. It was on the night of Wednesday, April 13th, 2 days before she was last seen. They spent the whole night together, drinking beer, kissing, and talking. They stayed up all night and exchanged numbers at dawn. Michelle then took a cab back home, which was only a few blocks away. That was the last time Edwin ever saw or spoke to Michelle. He spoke of their connection as almost surreal. It was a totally intellectual connection, and there was obviously a mutual physical attraction between the two, and at least for him, a very strong emotional one as well. He was genuinely bummed when Michelle never called him. Days passed, and then he heard the news about a young female who had died from a shark attack off Sunset Cliffs. He said he felt a darkness sink in when they described the girl as having a butterfly tattoo on her shoulder. There was a part of him that knew right away that it was Michelle. What could be considered suspicious, Edwin never contacted the police about who the woman might be. He later said that he just assumed they weren't releasing her name since the family had not been notified. Edwin Decker instead placed his strong emotions for Michelle by writing a poem called Shark Attack. This poem was included in a published collection titled Barzila and Other Psalms. The report said there was a tattoo, a butterfly on her shoulder, which I remembered that night on my couch when I, like the shark, chewed on her lips and took off her shirt. Kind of bizarre, suspicious, and even a little creepy sounding, but given the circumstances of their brief yet intense, intimate encounter and her macabre death only days later, it seems he made sense of the loss by over-romanticizing the moments they shared. I get it. I've been there in my own poetry before. There is also the fact that many years later, along with the journalist, he was the only one who pushed for the case to be reopened. In 2008, a 66-year-old man swimming with a group of people off the coast of Solana Beach was bitten by a great white shark. Although no one saw the shark, both of the man's legs had been ripped off, and according to Scripps expert Richard Rosenblatt, who was discussed earlier, consulted on Michelle Van Emster's case. He had zero doubt that it was a great white shark who had caused the man's fatal injuries. Unlike Michelle Van Emster's corpse, he did view the man's body and wounds. When the media reported this man's death, 2 other alleged shark victims were addressed, including Robert Pamperin, a man who had mysteriously disappeared off Alligator Head in La Jolla back in 1959, and Michelle von Emster. Except now, in Michelle's case, she wasn't acknowledged as a shark fatality by experts, and her name had been removed from any registries worldwide. Writer Neil Matthews, who was the only journalist to pen an investigative article about Michelle von Emster, read this information and reached out to Edwin Decker. Together, the 2 men composed a letter to Glenn Wagner, who was the medical examiner who replaced Brian Blackburn. They sent a sincere request that he reconsider her accidental cause of death determination in light of the recent fatal attack. Wagner responded in 2 days, clarifying that based on Collier's statement about Michelle having drowned first and then her body being ravaged by sharks after her death, he believed that was the primary reason why her case wasn't deemed as a confirmed fatal attack. Wagner also claimed that Brian Blackburn had responded with good science, although he did agree that some of her injuries, in particular her broken neck, ribs, and pelvic trauma, weren't commonly associated with shark wounds. He also noted how it was bizarre how Michelle's purse was located a significant distance away. It also made no sense that she would keep her jewelry on while she swam, when she had left her purse behind at the beach wall. It was later learned how on the Friday night, after she was last seen, a local man had found her belongings about a half-mile south from where Michelle's body was discovered. Around 11 p.m., the man, along with his girlfriend, was walking along the seawall, not far away from the pier at Ocean Beach, when all of a sudden his flashlight spotted something on the sand. At the base of the wall sat a purse. At the time, he picked it up and took it, but after hearing the news, he realized whose purse it was and brought it to the police station that Sunday. Inside was her driver's license, keys, likely to her shared home with Coco, a pack of cigarettes, some makeup, and a pay stub. Within her purse was also a fanny pack with $27 in cash. The last paycheck Michelle had picked up was never found, nor was it ever cashed anywhere. Now, if the timeline of events is believed to be accurate, this means that Michelle placed her belongings on the seawall sometime after 8 p.m. that Thursday night, and the purse just stayed there all day Friday in a heavily populated spot with people coming back and forth along the beach wall. This makes 0 sense, especially given how her cash was still inside. With its known number of drug users, alcoholics, vagrants, and some shady local surfers, the fact that Michelle's purse remained in open view for more than 24 hours without being taken should have been a sign to police that something wasn't adding up. But law enforcement never cared enough to look further into this element of the case, which indicated that her purse was placed there somewhere that Friday night by someone after Michelle had been killed. Homicide investigators and the medical examiner seemed to want to close this case under a shark attack and move on, although there were multiple reasons to look further at the forensic evidence and the people in Michelle von Emster's life. Police officers received multiple calls after the medical examiner declared her death an accident. Some people claimed Michelle had died as a result of a cleverly disguised murder. Some people said she was surfing at night and a boat ran her over. Or maybe she was struck by a vehicle and the offender threw her body over the railing in an attempt to conceal the crime. One call that Detective Mike Hurley received involved Michelle having been kidnapped, taken offshore, and thrown into a netted exposure with sharks alive for snuff film. Or maybe Michelle had gotten wasted on LSD while at a concert and thought it was a good idea to take a night swim. Maybe Michelle had screwed over a drug dealer and he drowned her. According to homicide detective Hurley, they did talk to a few people, but they never conducted a complete, thorough investigation into Michelle von Emster's death because based on the medical examiner's determination, there was no reason to believe foul play was involved. This is not the first time, and sadly will not be the last, that law enforcement and autopsy examiners write off a glaringly suspicious death as accidental. In Michelle von Emster's case, there are so many unanswered questions about both her death and her life. There was the mysterious man obsessed with making copies of Michelle's stolen autopsy report, who drove a motorcycle, who in all probability was the same man whom Michelle believed was stalking her. It doesn't make much sense that he was the one to cause her death, though, considering he wanted her autopsy findings to be copied and shared with as many people as possible. There was her roommate, Coco Campbell, who didn't appear very concerned or invested in figuring out her alleged friend's death, which I found to be odd and suspicious. I would suspect the borderline obsessed bartender and poet Edwin Decker, except he was the only person who directly in her circle was committed to find some answers and fought to get the case reopened. Then there was her family, who didn't seem to ask many questions or demand justice for Michelle, which is needless to say unsettling and strange. The statements made by Michelle's mother made her sound calloused to her death. Maybe it was just her way of not wanting to hurt more. According to Bernadette von Emster, she was hesitant to dig up more on her daughter's death, other than what was already horrifying to hear. But with Michelle being nude and the very cold temperatures, it did make her wonder whether foul play was involved and whether or not it was her responsibility to ask more questions. In 2019, one of Michelle's sisters, Teresa, wrote an article about how her family was destroyed by a local Catholic priest in San Carlos, California. She claimed that this man had sexually abused her sister Michelle. Due to the psychological weight Michelle carried, her life spun out of control. In the article, she discusses about how Michelle began experiencing mysterious fainting spells. Then she became increasingly more and more dependent upon drugs and alcohol. Teresa specifically states how Michelle's relationship with her family had been very strained for years, between Michelle dropping out of college and then battling cancer. While living in Ocean Beach, Michelle had become a heroin junkie, and at one point she was robbed at gunpoint at the cafe she worked in. Teresa states that the family now believes Michelle died from suicide. Now, on one hand, you could read this article and think, well, surely her family knew her best, and the mystery of Michelle von Emster's death is solved. But with how strained her relationship was with her family, did they really know her at all? None of what her sister says is supported by the autopsy, nor any of the known events and plans Michelle had made. I am not questioning that Michelle was a victim of abuse, but the other details Teresa describes don't line up. Michelle didn't even have a trace of alcohol or drugs in her system when she died. She had told her boss, Denise Knox, about a stalker from the cafe, but not about being robbed, which would be strange to mention one traumatic, very personal detail about someone's life and not the other. In addition to this story was never discussed by anyone in her life by reporters. There is also the fact that Michelle had given in her notice to move back to where her family was in the Bay Area. that doesn't describe a young woman who then one night decides to strip off her clothes and swim to her death in very cold water. I've already discussed the mounds of forensic evidence that don't simply add up to a woman diving off a cliff to either swim or end her life, and then who was fatally attacked by a shark. To me, her sister's article reads more like a family trying not to carry any of the emotional burden and maybe guilt of what happened to Michelle. It sounds as if it's easier to write off her sister's death as a suicide instead of asking more questions. The most obvious reason why the police should have looked further into her death was the conflicting evidence found on her body and the timeline. Unfortunately, the police just took the word of a medical examiner who didn't want to dig deeper into the unexplained factors of her autopsy, blaming it on a monster of the sea instead of searching for and hunting down a monster on land. Thank you so much for listening to the fascinating and sad story of Michelle von Emster. If you enjoy the show and want to support it, please make sure that you are following or subscribed on your listening platform of choice. Leave a rating and a review, and please share with a friend. Every one of your voices and inputs truly matters to me and the show. Again, thank you so much. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, written, researched, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereocode.